The metal bird screamed through the night sky, its rotors cutting through the darkness like a deadly whisper. Inside, Captain Sarah Chun gripped her rifle tighter as enemy fire lit up the horizon below. She had flown this route dozens of times, delivering supplies to forward operating bases deep in hostile territory. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the shadows seemed alive with danger. What happened next would test every ounce of her military training, her will to survive, and her determination to make it home alive. When their helicopter was struck by enemy fire and crashed behind enemy lines, Sarah found herself alone in a nightmare scenario that would push her beyond every limit she thought she had. This is the story of how one woman's refusal to give up turned a catastrophic military disaster into one of the most remarkable survival stories ever recorded. It's a tale of courage, ingenuity, and the unbreakable human spirit when faced with impossible odds. Captain Sarah Chun adjusted her headset as the Black Hawk helicopter lifted off from forward operating base Alpha at 0200 hours. The night air was crisp and cold, typical for the mountainous region where their conflict had been raging for 8 months. Sarah had been flying supply missions for 3 years, but this particular route always made her nervous. They would be crossing deep into territory controlled by insurgent forces, carrying medical supplies and ammunition to an isolated outpost that had been under siege for 2 weeks. The helicopter crew consisted of 4 people that night. Besides Sarah, there was Chief Warrant Officer Mike Rodriguez piloting the aircraft, Staff Sergeant David Kim manning the door gun, and Corporal Lisa Martinez handling communications and navigation. They had flown together many times before and trusted each other completely. This mission was supposed to be routine, but recent intelligence reports suggested increased enemy activity in their flight path. As they flew through the darkness, Sarah could see the landscape below through her night vision goggles. The terrain was rugged and unforgiving, filled with deep valleys, rocky outcroppings, and thick forests that could hide entire enemy units. The nearest friendly forces were more than 50 miles away from their destination, making this one of the most dangerous supply runs they regularly conducted. Rodriguez had been flying helicopters for 12 years and was known for his steady nerves under pressure. He kept the Black Hawk low to avoid enemy radar while navigating through mountain passes that required split-second timing and perfect coordination. Kim was positioned at the door gun, constantly scanning for threats while maintaining radio contact with intelligence units that were monitoring enemy movements in the area. Martinez worked with sophisticated communication equipment that allowed them to stay in contact with command headquarters and receive real-time updates about potential dangers along their route. She had been tracking weather patterns all evening and reported that visibility would remain clear for their entire mission, which was crucial for avoiding obstacles in the mountainous terrain. The cargo bay behind them contained critical medical supplies including blood products, antibiotics, and surgical equipment that the isolated outpost desperately needed. Several wounded soldiers were waiting for evacuation, and this mission would allow them to bring those men back to proper medical facilities. The ammunition they carried included specialized rounds needed to defend against the heavy weapons that insurgent forces had been using in recent attacks. 30 minutes into their flight, Martinez received an urgent radio transmission from intelligence analysts who had been monitoring enemy communications. Insurgent forces had moved 3 heavy weapons teams into positions along their planned route, and there were indications that they knew about the supply mission. Command gave them the option to abort and return to base, but the isolated outpost was running critically low on medical supplies. After quick discussion among the crew, they decided to continue with the mission but alter their approach route to avoid the known enemy positions. This would add 20 minutes to their flight time and require them to fly through a narrow canyon that offered limited options for emergency maneuvers. Rodriguez was confident in his ability to navigate the challenging terrain, and the crew agreed that the soldiers at the outpost needed their supplies too desperately to turn back. As they approached the canyon entrance, Kim reported movement on the ground that could indicate enemy forces positioning themselves for an ambush. The intelligence reports had been accurate about increased insurgent activity in the area. Sarah checked her weapons and ensured that her survival gear was properly secured, following standard procedures for high-risk missions. Each crew member carried enough emergency supplies to survive for several days if they were forced down in hostile territory. The canyon walls rose hundreds of feet on both sides of their flight path, creating an echo chamber that amplified the sound of their rotor blades. This made stealth impossible, but it was their only option for avoiding the heavy weapons teams that intelligence had identified along their original route. Rodriguez maintained constant communication with Martinez as she monitored their navigation systems and watched for any signs of mechanical problems that could become critical in such challenging terrain. Halfway through the canyon, Kim spotted muzzle flashes from multiple positions along the ridgeline above them. The enemy had anticipated their route change and positioned fighters to create a devastating crossfire. Tracer rounds began streaking past their aircraft as Rodriguez immediately initiated evasive maneuvers, dropping altitude and increasing speed to present a more difficult target for the insurgent weapons teams. The first round that struck their helicopter hit the tail rotor assembly, causing immediate vibration and making the aircraft much more difficult to control. Rodriguez fought with the controls as warning lights began flashing throughout the cockpit, indicating multiple system failures that were rapidly cascading through their aircraft. Sarah could feel the helicopter shuddering and pulling to one side as Rodriguez struggled to maintain level flight. Martinez was simultaneously trying to call for emergency support while monitoring their rapidly deteriorating mechanical situation. The radio communications were being jammed by enemy electronic warfare equipment, making it impossible to contact command headquarters or request immediate assistance from other aircraft in the area. Kim continued returning fire with the door gun, trying to suppress the enemy positions that were maintaining constant pressure on their damaged aircraft. A second enemy round struck their main rotor assembly, causing catastrophic damage that made continued flight impossible. Rodriguez had perhaps 30 seconds to find a place to crash land before they lost complete control of the aircraft. The canyon floor was rocky and uneven, offering no good options for emergency landing. But he spotted a small clearing near a stream that might give them a chance for survival. Sarah braced herself as Rodriguez auto-rotated the damaged helicopter toward the clearing, using every bit of his skill and experience to maintain some control during their rapid descent. The aircraft was shaking violently and losing altitude fast, but Rodriguez managed to keep them generally upright as they approached the ground. She could see trees rushing past outside her window and knew that their survival would depend on the next few seconds. The helicopter hit the ground hard, bouncing twice before the landing gear collapsed and the aircraft rolled onto its side. Sarah felt her shoulder slam against the door frame as the cabin filled with dust and debris from the impact. The sound of twisting metal and breaking equipment was deafening, followed by an ominous silence as the engines finally shut down. Steam was rising from the damaged rotor assembly, and she could smell fuel leaking from the aircraft systems. Rodriguez was unconscious and bleeding from a head wound, but Sarah could see that he was still breathing. Kim had been thrown from his position during the crash and was lying motionless near the door gun. Martinez was conscious but trapped under communication equipment that had broken loose during the impact. Sarah realized that she was the only crew member who was uninjured and capable of immediate action. She quickly assessed their situation and knew that they had very little time before enemy forces would reach their crash site. The helicopter was too damaged to provide effective cover, and they were carrying weapons and equipment that the insurgents would want to capture. Sarah had to make critical decisions about rescue priorities and defensive preparations while dealing with the shock and disorientation that followed their violent crash landing. The sound of gunfire was getting closer as insurgent forces moved down. The first enemy fighters appeared at the canyon rim, just as Sarah finished treating Kim's injuries. Through her binoculars, she could see at least 8 insurgents beginning their descent toward the crash site, moving with military precision that indicated formal training and combat experience. They were armed with automatic rifles and rocket-propelled grenades, more than enough firepower to overwhelm her small group of injured crew members. Sarah had approximately 5 minutes to complete her defensive preparations before the insurgents would be close enough to launch their attack. She positioned Martinez behind the largest boulder with a rifle and several magazines of ammunition, despite her broken leg making movement painful and difficult. Martinez was an excellent marksman and could provide covering fire if Sarah needed to reposition during the coming battle. Rodriguez was becoming more coherent as he recovered from his head injury, but he remained weak and disoriented from the crash. Sarah gave him a pistol and positioned him where he could guard Kim while she and Martinez dealt with the approaching enemy fighters. Kim was unconscious again and clearly needed immediate medical attention that was impossible to provide under their current circumstances. The crashed helicopter was smoking from electrical fires that had started after the impact, creating a column of black smoke that would be visible for miles around. This meant that additional enemy forces would likely be converging on their position, but it also meant that any friendly aircraft in the area would be able to locate them quickly if rescue operations were being organized. Sarah distributed grenades and extra ammunition among her crew members, keeping most of the explosives for herself since she would be doing the majority of the fighting. She also prepared several improvised explosive devices using materials from the helicopter, placing them in positions where advancing insurgents would likely take cover during their assault. The sound of enemy fighters moving through the rocky terrain was getting steadily closer as they coordinated their approach to surround the crash site. Sarah could hear their voices as they communicated with each other, discussing tactics and sharing information about the defensive positions they could observe from higher ground. Their discipline and organization suggested that these were experienced fighters rather than local militia. Sarah used her radio equipment to broadcast emergency signals on all available frequencies, hoping that someone would receive their distress calls and coordinate rescue operations. She included their exact coordinates and a brief description of their tactical situation, emphasizing that they had wounded crew members who needed immediate medical evacuation. The radio responses remained silent except for occasional static and interference. The stream that ran past their position provided some concealment and an avenue for potential escape if their defensive positions became untenable. Sarah studied the terrain and identified several routes that could allow them to move away from the crash site while maintaining some cover from enemy fire. However, carrying 3 injured crew members would make any movement extremely slow and dangerous. 8 minutes after spotting the first enemy fighters, Sarah saw muzzle flashes from multiple positions as the insurgents opened fire on their defensive positions. Bullets struck the rocks around them and ricocheted off the crashed helicopter, creating a deadly environment that required constant movement to avoid being hit by accurate enemy fire. Sarah returned fire with controlled bursts, trying to conserve ammunition while keeping the attackers from advancing. Martinez proved to be as effective as Sarah had expected, placing precise shots that forced several insurgents to retreat to better cover and disrupted their coordinated assault. Her broken leg limited her mobility, but her marksmanship skills were unaffected by the injury. Working together, Sarah and Martinez were able to establish overlapping fields of fire that covered most approaches to their position. Rodriguez managed to contribute some defensive fire despite his head injury, though his accuracy was limited by ongoing disorientation from the crash. His presence allowed Sarah to focus on the most dangerous threats while knowing that someone was protecting Kim, who remained unconscious and completely vulnerable to enemy fire. The crew was working together as effectively as possible given their injuries and limited resources. The insurgent fighters were professional enough to avoid taking unnecessary risks, advancing by short rushes between available cover while maintaining suppressive fire to keep Sarah's crew pinned down. This methodical approach meant that the battle was likely to last longer than a direct assault, but it also gave Sarah more time to use her defensive preparations effectively and possibly receive assistance from friendly forces. 15 minutes into the firefight, one of Sarah's improvised explosive devices detonated as an insurgent fighter moved through a predicted avenue of approach. The explosion eliminated one enemy fighter and wounded another, temporarily disrupting their coordinated attack and forcing them to reassess their tactics. Sarah had placed these devices carefully to channel enemy movement into areas where she could engage them most effectively. The insurgents responded by increasing their use of grenades and rocket-propelled weapons, trying to destroy the defensive positions without exposing themselves to accurate return fire. Several explosions near their position showered Sarah and her crew with rock fragments and debris, but the boulders they were using for cover proved substantial enough to protect them from anything except direct hits. Kim briefly regained consciousness during a lull in the fighting and was able to provide Sarah with important information about the tactical situation. Despite his serious injuries, he had been observing enemy movements and could identify positions that Sarah had not yet detected. His knowledge of infantry tactics helped her anticipate the next phase of the insurgent assault. Sarah realized that the enemy fighters were trying to position themselves for a final coordinated assault from multiple directions simultaneously. Once they achieved proper positioning, her small group would be quickly overwhelmed unless she could disrupt their preparations or receive immediate assistance. She decided to conduct a limited counterattack to force them to retreat and reorganize their approach. Using smoke grenades to conceal her movement, Sarah advanced toward the nearest enemy position while Martinez provided covering fire from their defensive position. The smoke provided enough concealment for her to approach within grenade range of two insurgent fighters who had been providing suppressive fire against her crew members. She was able to eliminate both fighters and capture their weapons and ammunition. The counterattack forced the remaining insurgents to withdraw to more distant positions, giving Sarah's crew some breathing room and reducing the immediate pressure on their defensive positions. However, she knew that this was only a temporary reprieve and that the enemy fighters would soon regroup with additional reinforcements who were likely approaching their location. Rodriguez's condition was gradually improving as he recovered from his concussion, allowing him to contribute more effectively to their defense. He took over responsibility for monitoring Kim's medical condition while Sarah and Martinez focused on maintaining their perimeter security. Kim was stable but clearly needed evacuation to proper medical facilities as soon as possible. During the temporary lull in fighting, Sarah was able to retrieve additional supplies from the crashed helicopter, including medical equipment, food, water, and spare batteries for their radio equipment. The helicopter was still burning in some areas, but most of the cargo compartment remained accessible and undamaged by the crash or subsequent enemy fire. Sarah attempted several more radio transmissions on different frequencies, varying her broadcast times and locations to avoid enemy jamming equipment. She finally received a faint response from what sounded like a friendly aircraft, but the transmission was too weak and interference too severe to establish reliable communication. She continued broadcasting their position and situation on multiple channels. The insurgent fighters returned in larger numbers just as darkness was beginning to fall across the canyon. Sarah could see movement in at least 12 different positions surrounding their crash site, indicating that substantial reinforcements had arrived during the temporary ceasefire. The enemy now had enough fighters to launch simultaneous attacks from multiple directions while maintaining reserve forces. Sarah knew that their defensive ammunition was running low and that they could not survive another prolonged firefight against superior numbers of enemy fighters. She began preparing for the possibility that they would need to abandon their current positions and attempt to evade capture while moving toward friendly territory. This would be extremely dangerous with 3 injured crew members, but capture was not an acceptable alternative. Martinez had been monitoring enemy radio communications using equipment salvaged from their helicopter and reported that additional insurgent forces were moving to establish blocking positions along potential escape routes. The enemy was clearly planning to either capture or eliminate Sarah's crew rather than simply driving them away from the crash site. Sarah made the difficult decision to prepare for immediate evacuation from their defensive positions. She organized their limited supplies into packages that could be carried while moving quickly through difficult terrain. Medical supplies and ammunition received priority, while heavier equipment would have to be abandoned if they were forced to leave their current location. The final enemy assault began just after full darkness fell across the canyon. Coordinated fire from multiple positions pinned Sarah's crew down, while other insurgent fighters advanced under cover of intense suppressive fire. Sarah responded with her remaining grenades and explosive devices, but she knew that their defensive positions would be overrun within minutes unless something changed dramatically. At the moment when their situation seemed hopeless, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotor blades approaching from the direction of friendly territory. Emergency radio transmissions finally broke through the enemy jamming as rescue aircraft established contact and requested information about their tactical situation. The approaching helicopters were armed gunships capable of engaging the insurgent forces that had been attacking the crash site. Sarah used emergency signal devices to mark their positions for the incoming rescue aircraft while directing defensive fire to keep insurgent fighters from overrunning their location during the final minutes before help arrived. The sound of approaching helicopters caused some of the enemy fighters to retreat toward better cover, reducing the immediate pressure on her crew's defensive positions. The rescue helicopters arrived with devastating firepower that the rescue helicopters were forced to abort their evacuation mission when massive enemy reinforcements arrived with heavy weapons capable of destroying aircraft. Sarah watched helplessly as the gunships provided covering fire while retreating to safe distance, leaving her and her wounded crew members stranded in the canyon with insufficient ammunition and supplies to survive another prolonged engagement with insurgent forces. Within minutes of the rescue aircraft departure, enemy fighters began advancing on their position again, this time with overwhelming numbers and heavy weapons that made their defensive position completely untenable. Sarah realized that their only chance for survival was immediate evacuation from the crash site, despite the serious injuries affecting 3 of her 4 crew members. Rodriguez had recovered enough from his concussion to walk with assistance, though he remained weak and disoriented from his head injury. Martinez could move short distances despite her broken leg, but would require help over difficult terrain. Kim was conscious, but clearly had internal injuries that made any movement extremely dangerous to his survival. Sarah faced an impossible choice between abandoning a crew member or risking everyone's lives. After quick consultation with her injured crew, they decided that Kim would remain hidden near the crash site with emergency supplies and radio equipment while the other 3 attempted to reach friendly territory on foot. Kim insisted that his injuries made him a liability for the group's movement, and that Sarah's primary responsibility was getting the other survivors to safety. This was the most difficult decision Sarah had ever made. Sarah established a concealed position for Kim among the rocks near the stream, providing him with medical supplies, emergency rations, water purification tablets, and radio equipment for continued distress calls. She camouflaged the position carefully and gave Kim specific instructions for contacting rescue forces if communication became possible. The plan was for rescue teams to return for Kim once the other survivors reached safety. The 3 mobile survivors began moving up the canyon toward friendly territory just as enemy forces resumed their assault on the crash site area. Sarah helped Rodriguez and Martinez navigate the rocky terrain while maintaining security against pursuit by insurgent fighters who were systematically searching the area around the downed helicopter. Movement was slow and extremely dangerous. Sarah had studied maps of the region during her mission briefings and knew that friendly territory was approximately 40 miles away across mountainous terrain that included several major obstacles. The route would require crossing at least 2 rivers, navigating through dense forest areas, and avoiding populated areas where insurgent sympathizers might report their movements to enemy forces. The first few hours of movement were the most dangerous because they remained close to the crash site where large numbers of enemy fighters were conducting search operations. Sarah had to balance speed with stealth, helping her injured crew members move as quickly as possible while avoiding detection by insurgent patrols that were systematically examining potential escape routes. Rodriguez's head injury made him prone to confusion and disorientation, requiring constant supervision to prevent him from making noise or moving in wrong directions. Martinez was managing her broken leg remarkably well, but the injury significantly slowed their progress and would become more problematic as exhaustion accumulated over long-distance movement through difficult terrain. By dawn of their first day on foot, Sarah's group had managed to move approximately 8 miles from the crash site, reaching a forested area that provided better concealment than the rocky canyon terrain. However, they were all exhausted from the night movement and needed rest before continuing their journey toward friendly territory. Sarah found a concealed position where they could remain hidden during daylight hours. Sarah established a defensive perimeter and organized rotating watch schedules that would allow Rodriguez and Martinez to rest while maintaining security against enemy patrols. She used this time to treat their injuries more thoroughly, redistribute their limited supplies, and plan the next phase of their movement toward safety. Food and water were already becoming critical concerns. During the day, Sarah observed several enemy helicopters conducting search patterns over the area where they had been moving. The insurgents were clearly conducting systematic operations to locate and capture the surviving crew members, using aircraft and ground forces in coordinated search patterns that covered all possible escape routes. Avoiding detection was becoming increasingly difficult. Sarah realized that their movement during the previous night had left tracks and other signs that experienced trackers could follow to locate their current position. She decided that they would need to change their tactics, using water movement and other techniques to break their trail while increasing the distance between their group and pursuing enemy forces. That evening, they began following a mountain stream that flowed generally in the direction of friendly territory while providing water for drinking and concealment for their movement. The stream bed was rocky and difficult for walking, especially for Martinez with her broken leg, but it would make tracking much more difficult for pursuing insurgent forces. The stream led them through increasingly mountainous terrain that was both advantageous and problematic for their survival situation. The mountains provided excellent concealment and made vehicle movement impossible for pursuing enemy forces, but they also created navigation challenges and required more time to traverse than direct routes across easier terrain. Food became a critical issue during their second day of movement. Sarah's group had emergency rations for approximately 3 days, but their physical exertion in mountainous terrain was consuming calories faster than anticipated. Sarah began supplementing their diet with edible plants and roots that she recognized from survival training, but these provided limited nutritional value. Water was less problematic because of the stream they were following, but Sarah had to be careful about water purification to prevent illness that could incapacitate her injured crew members. She used water purification tablets and boiling when fuel was available, but had to balance these time-consuming processes against the need for continued movement toward safety. Rodriguez's condition was gradually improving as he recovered from his concussion, allowing him to contribute more effectively to navigation and security activities. However, the physical demands of cross-country movement were taxing his strength, and Sarah was concerned about his ability to maintain the pace necessary for reaching friendly territory before their supplies were exhausted. Martinez was demonstrating remarkable determination in dealing with her broken leg, but Sarah could see that the injury was causing increasing pain and limiting her mobility. They had basic medical supplies for pain management, but nothing that could properly treat a serious fracture under field conditions. Martinez would need professional medical attention soon. On their third night of movement, Sarah's group encountered their first direct contact with enemy forces since leaving the crash site. A 4-man insurgent patrol was positioned along their route of movement, apparently conducting systematic searches for the missing helicopter crew. Sarah had to decide whether to bypass the patrol or eliminate the threat. Sarah chose to bypass the enemy patrol by detouring through more difficult terrain that required several additional hours of movement. This decision avoided immediate combat, but used precious time and energy that her injured crew members could not afford. The detour also moved them away from their planned route toward friendly territory. The encounter with enemy forces confirmed that insurgent units were actively searching for Sarah's group and had positioned patrols along likely escape routes. This meant that further contacts were probable and that their movement would become increasingly dangerous as they approached areas where enemy forces could predict their destination. Sarah modified their movement tactics to include more sophisticated counter-tracking techniques and longer observation periods before advancing through areas that might contain enemy forces. These procedures reduced their speed significantly, but were necessary for avoiding capture or elimination by numerically superior insurgent forces. By the end of their 4th day on foot, Rodriguez was showing signs of serious medical problems related to his head injury. He was experiencing severe headaches, periods of confusion, and occasional loss of balance that made movement through difficult terrain increasingly dangerous. Sarah realized that he needed medical attention that was impossible to provide under their current circumstances. Martinez's broken leg was also becoming more problematic as swelling increased, and her pain became more severe. She was having difficulty maintaining the pace necessary for reaching safety before their supplies were exhausted. Both injured crew members were pushing themselves beyond reasonable limits to avoid slowing the group's progress. Food supplies were nearly exhausted, and Sarah's attempts to supplement Sarah approached the enemy-controlled valley with extreme caution, spending an entire day observing insurgent patrol patterns and defensive positions before attempting to move her injured crew members through the area. The valley contained the only practical route to the evacuation site that had been recommended by friendly forces, but it was heavily defended by experienced fighters who knew the terrain intimately. The insurgent forces had established 3 observation posts on high ground overlooking the valley floor, with roving patrols moving between fixed positions every few hours. Sarah identified at least 20 enemy fighters in the immediate area, armed with automatic weapons, mortars, and communications equipment that could summon additional forces quickly if her group was detected during their crossing attempt. Rodriguez was experiencing increasing difficulty with balance and coordination as his head injury continued to affect his recovery. Sarah had to provide physical assistance for his movement over rough terrain, which significantly increased the time required for any tactical maneuver. His condition was clearly deteriorating despite her efforts to manage his medical care with limited supplies. Martinez had developed a serious infection in her broken leg that was causing fever and weakness in addition to the ongoing pain from her fracture. Sarah was treating the infection with antibiotics from their emergency medical supplies, but the medication was nearly exhausted and the infection showed signs of spreading throughout her system. Martinez needed immediate professional medical treatment. Water was becoming critically short as they moved away from the stream that had provided their primary source during the previous days of movement. Sarah had located 2 possible water sources in the valley, but both were near enemy positions that would require her to approach within detection range of insurgent forces. She would have to obtain water during their crossing attempt or face dehydration. Food supplies were completely exhausted except for one emergency meal that Sarah was saving for absolute necessity. She had been unable to locate sufficient edible plants in the mountainous terrain, and the physical demands of caring for injured crew members while maintaining security were consuming energy faster than she could replenish through scavenging. Sarah's ammunition was reduced to 3 magazines for her rifle and 1 magazine for her pistol, barely enough for one significant engagement with enemy forces. She had 2 grenades and 1 smoke grenade remaining from their original supplies, insufficient for conducting any major tactical operations. Conservation of ammunition was essential for their survival. The radio equipment was experiencing battery problems that limited transmission range and reliability. Sarah had been unable to re-establish contact with friendly forces since receiving instructions about the evacuation site 2 days previously. She was operating without current information about enemy movements or rescue operations that might be coordinated to assist their escape. Sarah decided to attempt their valley crossing during the hour before dawn, when insurgent forces would be least alert and visibility would be minimal for enemy observation posts. This timing would allow them to reach concealed positions on the opposite side before full daylight exposed them to enemy surveillance. The plan required precise coordination and perfect execution. She positioned Rodriguez and Martinez in a concealed location where they could remain hidden if the crossing attempt failed, and she was killed or captured attempting to clear the route. Sarah provided them with her remaining medical supplies and emergency food, along with instructions for contacting rescue forces if radio communication became possible. This was preparation for the possibility that she might not survive. Moving alone through the darkness, Sarah approached the nearest enemy position to assess defensive arrangements and identify the best route for bringing her injured crew members through the area. The insurgent fighters were maintaining irregular watch schedules that created brief opportunities for movement, but timing would be critical for avoiding detection. Sarah eliminated the enemy sentry at the first observation post using silent techniques that prevented any alarm from being raised. She recovered the sentry's weapon and ammunition while studying the communications equipment that could summon reinforcements. The position provided an excellent view of the valley floor and would have made their crossing impossible without neutralizing this threat. The second observation post proved more challenging because it was manned by two fighters who were maintaining better security procedures. Sarah had to wait for an opportunity when both sentries were focused in the same direction before approaching close enough to engage them simultaneously. The engagement was successful but used her last grenade and created noise that might alert other enemy forces. With two observation posts neutralized, Sarah had created a window of opportunity for moving Rodriguez and Martinez across the valley floor to reach the evacuation site. However, the third observation post remained active and could detect their movement if they were not extremely careful about concealment and timing. Sarah had no remaining explosives for eliminating this final threat. Sarah returned to collect her injured crew members and began the most dangerous phase of their escape. Rodriguez's balance problems made movement across uneven terrain extremely slow and dangerous, requiring Sarah to provide constant physical support while maintaining security against possible enemy contact. Martinez was weakened by fever but maintained determination to reach safety. Halfway across the valley floor, the remaining enemy observation post detected their movement and began directing automatic weapons fire toward their position. Sarah immediately sought cover while returning fire to suppress the enemy position, but her limited ammunition made sustained engagement impossible. They were pinned down in an exposed position with little available cover. Rodriguez managed to contribute effective return fire despite his medical condition, helping to keep enemy fighters from advancing to overrun their position. Martinez was unable to move effectively, but provided additional firepower from her prone position behind minimal cover. The crew was working together professionally despite their desperate circumstances and deteriorating physical condition. Sarah realized that they could not survive a prolonged firefight with their limited ammunition and the exposed nature of their position. She decided to conduct a desperate assault on the remaining enemy position, using smoke to conceal her approach while Rodriguez and Martinez provided covering fire from their current location. This was an extremely high-risk tactic with little chance of success. The smoke grenade provided enough concealment for Sarah to approach within grenade range of the enemy position before the insurgent fighters could adjust their defensive fire to her new location. Her final grenade eliminated the remaining observation post and cleared the route for continuing their movement toward the evacuation site. However, the combat had certainly alerted other enemy forces in the area. Sarah collected Rodriguez and Martinez and resumed movement toward the evacuation site as quickly as their injuries would permit. They could hear enemy vehicles and helicopters responding to the engagement, indicating that substantial insurgent forces were mobilizing to locate and eliminate them before they could reach safety. Time was now their most critical factor. The evacuation site was located in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, approximately 2 miles from where they had engaged the enemy observation posts. Sarah's radio equipment indicated weak signals from friendly aircraft in the area, suggesting that rescue operations were being coordinated despite continued enemy interference with communications. Rodriguez collapsed from exhaustion and complications related to his head injury just as they reached the edge of the evacuation clearing. Sarah could see that he was experiencing serious medical problems that required immediate attention beyond her capabilities with field medical supplies. He was conscious, but experiencing severe disorientation and physical weakness. Martinez was also showing signs of serious medical deterioration as her infection spread and fever increased. Sarah administered their last antibiotic doses and used remaining medical supplies to stabilize both crew members while attempting to establish radio contact with incoming rescue aircraft. All 3 survivors were now in critical medical condition. Enemy helicopters appeared over the area, just as Sarah established radio contact with friendly rescue aircraft approaching from the opposite direction. The evacuation would have to be conducted under direct enemy fire, with rescue helicopters exposed to ground-based weapons while attempting to land in the clearing. The tactical situation had become extremely dangerous for everyone involved. Sarah used emergency signal devices to mark their exact location while preparing defensive positions to protect Rodriguez and Martinez during the evacuation process. She had no remaining ammunition for sustained combat, but could provide limited covering fire to assist rescue operations. The success of their evacuation would depend primarily on the capabilities of incoming friendly aircraft. The first rescue helicopter attempted to land under intense enemy fire from insurgent forces who had reached positions surrounding the evacuation site. Sarah watched as the aircraft took multiple hits while attempting to reach her crew members, forcing the pilot to abort the landing attempt and withdraw to safer distance. The rescue operation was failing under enemy pressure. Sarah realized that successful evacuation would require eliminating alone in hostile territory, with enemy forces converging on her position from multiple directions. Sarah faced the most desperate phase of her survival ordeal. The successful evacuation of Rodriguez and Martinez had been accomplished at the cost of revealing her exact location to substantial insurgent forces who were now conducting systematic operations to capture or eliminate her before additional rescue attempts could be mounted. Sarah had captured an enemy radio during her earlier engagements and could monitor insurgent communications as they coordinated their search operations. The enemy forces included at least 50 fighters with vehicles, helicopters, and heavy weapons, operating under professional command structure that indicated formal military training rather than a regular militia organization. They were treating her capture as a high-priority mission. Her ammunition situation was critical, consisting of 2 magazines for a captured enemy rifle and 1 magazine for her pistol. This was insufficient for any sustained engagement with the overwhelming numbers of insurgent forces that were systematically searching the area around the evacuation site. Sarah would have to rely on stealth and evasion rather than direct combat to survive. Water had become a desperate need after 6 days of continuous movement and combat operations. Sarah located a small stream approximately half a mile from the evacuation clearing, but reaching the water source required movement through areas that were being actively patrolled by enemy forces. She would have to obtain water during darkness while avoiding multiple insurgent units. Food remained completely unavailable except for wild plants that provided minimal nutrition for the physical demands she was facing. Sarah's energy reserves were critically depleted after days of combat stress, limited sleep, and inadequate nutrition. Her physical condition was deteriorating rapidly and affecting her ability to think clearly and react quickly to dangerous situations. The forest terrain provided excellent concealment, but also created navigation challenges that were complicated by her exhausted condition and lack of reliable maps for the specific area where she was now operating. Sarah had to maintain a general sense of direction toward friendly territory while avoiding enemy forces and searching for water and shelter. Sarah established a concealed observation position where she could monitor enemy search patterns while planning her next movement toward safety. The insurgent forces were conducting professional search operations that included systematic grid searches, checkpoint operations, and aerial surveillance using helicopters equipped with thermal imaging equipment that could detect her body heat. During her first night alone, Sarah successfully reached the water source and replenished her supply while avoiding 3 different enemy patrols that were moving through the area. The water was contaminated and required purification, but she had no remaining purification tablets and no fuel for boiling. She was forced to drink untreated water and risk illness. Sarah moved continuously during darkness and remained hidden during daylight hours when enemy aircraft were conducting intensive search operations over the area. This pattern allowed her to maintain distance from pursuing ground forces while gradually moving toward friendly territory, but her progress was extremely slow due to the need for avoiding detection. On her second day alone, Sarah discovered that she had contracted dysentery from the contaminated water, creating additional medical problems that severely weakened her physical condition. The illness caused dehydration and fever that affected her judgment and physical capabilities while she was facing the most dangerous portion of her survival situation. Enemy forces had established a series of checkpoints and observation posts along all routes leading toward friendly territory, creating multiple barriers that Sarah would have to bypass or eliminate to continue her escape. The insurgent forces were clearly planning to prevent her from reaching safety, rather than simply driving her away from their operational area. Sarah's radio equipment had finally failed completely due to battery exhaustion and damage accumulated during combat operations. She could no longer monitor enemy communications or attempt contact with friendly forces that might be conducting rescue operations. She was operating with no information about external assistance that might be available. Despite her deteriorating physical condition, Sarah maintained military discipline and continued moving toward friendly territory using navigation techniques that did not depend on electronic equipment. She estimated her location using terrain features and celestial navigation, maintaining general awareness of direction and distance despite exhaustion and illness. On her third night alone, Sarah encountered a four-man enemy patrol that she could not avoid due to their positioning across her planned route of movement. With her limited ammunition, she could not engage all four fighters simultaneously and survive. She had to find an alternative method for eliminating this obstacle to her continued movement. Sarah used improvised explosive devices created from materials salvaged during her previous engagements, placing them in positions where the enemy patrol would likely take cover if they detected her presence. This allowed her to eliminate 3 of the 4 fighters when they responded to her diversionary activities, though the engagement used most of her remaining ammunition. The surviving enemy fighter escaped to report her location and activities to insurgent command elements, ensuring that additional forces would be dispatched to her area. Sarah had gained passage through the checkpoint but had also compromised her concealment and guaranteed that pursuit would intensify during the following days. Sarah's physical condition continued deteriorating as dysentery, dehydration, and exhaustion accumulated over days of continuous stress and inadequate nutrition. She was experiencing periods of disorientation and weakness that made movement dangerous and affected her ability to make sound tactical decisions. Medical attention was becoming as critical as reaching safety. During her 4th day alone, Sarah observed friendly aircraft conducting search patterns in areas several miles away from her current position. The aircraft appeared to be looking for her based on their systematic search procedures, but they were too distant for her to signal effectively with her remaining emergency equipment. Sarah modified her movement to approach the areas where friendly aircraft were conducting search operations, despite the increased risk of encountering enemy forces who were also monitoring these activities. Her survival now depended on making contact with friendly forces before her physical condition deteriorated beyond the point where she could continue effective movement. The enemy had positioned additional forces along her route toward the friendly search areas, requiring Sarah to eliminate or bypass multiple insurgent positions during a single night of movement. This was beyond her capabilities with depleted ammunition and weakened physical condition, but she had no alternative except attempting breakthrough operations. Sarah successfully bypassed 2 enemy positions using stealth techniques, but was forced to engage a 3rd position that detected her movement and began pursuing her toward the area where friendly aircraft were operating. The engagement used her last rifle ammunition and left her with only 1 magazine for her pistol. The firefight attracted attention from both friendly and enemy forces in the area. Sarah could see enemy helicopters approaching from one direction, while friendly aircraft responded from another direction. The converging forces would create a major engagement that could either rescue her or result in her elimination, depending on timing and tactical coordination. Sarah used her last emergency flare to signal friendly aircraft while seeking cover from the approaching enemy helicopters. The flare provided clear identification of her location to both sides, committing her to immediate action rather than continued evasion. Everything now depended on which forces would reach her position first. Friendly helicopters arrived simultaneously with enemy forces, creating an intense engagement around Sarah's position as both sides attempted to control the area. Sarah provided what assistance she could with her remaining pistol ammunition, while friendly forces engaged insurgent fighters who were attempting to prevent her rescue. The rescue helicopter managed to reach Sarah's position and extract her under intense enemy fire, though the aircraft sustained significant damage during the evacuation. Sarah finally reached safety after 7 days of continuous survival operations behind enemy lines, but Her ordeal had pushed her beyond all physical and mental limits. Medical examination revealed that Sarah had lost 30 pounds during her week-long survival experience and was suffering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, infection, and exhaustion that required immediate intensive care. Her injuries were serious enough that recovery would require several weeks of hospitalization and rehabilitation before she could return to duty. Rodriguez and Martinez had both survived their injuries and were recovering in military hospitals where they could receive proper treatment for their wounds. Kim had also been successfully rescued from the crash site by follow-up operations that located him after Sarah's escape provided intelligence about his position. All 4 crew members had survived their ordeal. Sarah's successful escape and the intelligence she provided about enemy operations led to military actions that eliminated the insurgent forces responsible for shooting down their helicopter. The information about enemy positions, tactics, and organization proved valuable for preventing similar attacks on other aircraft conducting supply missions in the region. The survival story became legendary within military aviation circles as an example of leadership, determination, and professional competence under the most extreme circumstances. Sarah received several military decorations for her actions during the helicopter crash and subsequent escape operations that saved the lives of her entire crew. Years later, Sarah continued serving as a helicopter pilot while also instructing other aviators in survival techniques and emergency procedures. Her experience provided valuable lessons about maintaining hope and continuing effective action even when situations appeared hopeless. She had proven that proper training, strong determination, and refusal to accept defeat could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The story demonstrated that individual courage and competence could make the difference between survival and disaster when military operations went wrong in hostile territory. Sarah's actions during those 7 days behind enemy lines had saved 4 lives and provided an inspiring example of military professionalism under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Her survival had required the integration of multiple skills including medical treatment, tactical planning, weapons employment, navigation, communications, leadership, and individual courage maintained over extended periods of extreme stress. The combination of technical competence and personal determination had enabled her to accomplish what many considered impossible. Sarah's story continued to inspire military personnel facing their own challenging situations, proving that ordinary individuals could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded exceptional performance. Her experience demonstrated that survival often depends not on special talents or unusual resources, but on the willingness to continue fighting when giving up seems like the only rational choice, or suppressing the enemy forces that were preventing rescue aircraft from landing safely. With no remaining ammunition or explosives, she would have to use captured enemy weapons and whatever tactical advantages she could create through movement and positioning. Drawing enemy fire away from the evacuation site, Sarah conducted a series of diversionary attacks using weapons captured from the insurgent observation posts she had eliminated earlier. This allowed the rescue helicopter to attempt another landing approach while enemy forces were distracted by her movement in different areas around the clearing. The second rescue attempt was successful, with the helicopter landing just long enough for medical personnel to load Rodriguez and Martinez aboard before taking off under continued enemy fire. Sarah provided covering fire until the aircraft was safely away from the area, ensuring that her injured crew members would receive the medical treatment they desperately needed. However, Sarah herself was unable to board the rescue helicopter before it was forced to depart under intense enemy pressure. She remained stranded in the evacuation area with substantial insurgent forces closing in on her position. Her crew members were safe, but her own survival would depend on evading capture until additional rescue operations could be mounted. Their diet with local plants were providing inadequate nutrition for the physical demands they were facing. She began rationing their remaining emergency food more strictly while searching for better sources of nutrition in the wild. Hunting was impossible because gunfire would attract enemy attention. Sarah estimated that they were still approximately 25 miles from friendly territory, a distance that would require at least 4 more days of movement through mountainous terrain. With their current supply situation and the deteriorating condition of her injured crew members, reaching safety was becoming increasingly unlikely without external assistance. On their 5th night, Sarah made radio contact with friendly forces for the first time since the rescue helicopters had been forced to abort their evacuation mission. The transmission was weak and intermittent, but she was able to provide updated location information and request guidance for reaching the nearest safe area where evacuation might be possible. The radio contact revealed that substantial search and rescue operations were being conducted, but that enemy forces had established blocking positions along most direct routes to friendly territory. Sarah was advised to continue moving toward a specific location where rescue forces might be able to establish a temporary landing zone for helicopter evacuation. However, the recommended route would require crossing an area where insurgent forces maintained permanent positions and conducted regular patrols. Sarah would have to choose between the dangers of attempting passage through enemy-controlled territory or continuing their current route with inadequate supplies and deteriorating crew member condition. Sarah decided to attempt reaching the recommended evacuation site because it offered the best chance for getting proper medical treatment for Rodriguez and Martinez. This decision committed her group to movement through the most dangerous part of their journey, where contact with enemy forces was virtually certain and their survival would depend on avoiding detection. The final phase of their escape would test every aspect of Sarah's military training and leadership abilities. She would have to navigate through enemy territory while caring for injured crew members, manage their depleted supplies, and maintain operational security against numerically superior forces. Success would require perfect execution combined with considerable luck. As medical personnel from the rescue helicopters began treating her crew members, Sarah realized that their survival had depended on a combination of training, determination, teamwork, and considerable luck. The crashed helicopter had provided some protection, the terrain had offered defensive advantages, and the enemy fighters had been cautious enough in their approach to allow rescue forces time to locate and assist them. However, Sarah's ordeal was far from over. As the rescue helicopters prepared to evacuate her wounded crew members, new intelligence reports indicated that large numbers of additional insurgent forces were converging on their location. The rescue operation would have to be conducted under intense enemy pressure, and there was serious doubt about whether all aircraft would be able to safely evacuate the area before being overwhelmed. And from their positions on the canyon ridges, Sarah could hear voices calling to each other in the local language as they coordinated their approach to the crash site. She estimated that they had perhaps 10 minutes before the enemy would be close enough to launch a direct assault on their position. Working quickly, Sarah pulled Rodriguez from the pilot's seat and dragged him to cover behind some large rocks near the stream. His head wound was serious, but not immediately life-threatening, and she used medical supplies from her survival kit to stop the bleeding and stabilize his condition. Rodriguez was starting to regain consciousness, but remained disoriented and unable to help with their defensive preparations. Kim was more seriously injured with what appeared to be internal injuries from being thrown during the crash. Sarah managed to move him to the same protected position, but realized that he would need immediate medical attention to survive. His breathing was shallow and irregular, indicating possible lung damage that could quickly become fatal without proper treatment. Martinez had managed to free herself from the communication equipment, but had suffered a badly broken leg that made movement extremely difficult. She was still conscious and alert, able to help with planning their defense, but unable to move effectively or contribute to physical preparations for the coming battle with insurgent forces. Sarah quickly inventoried their available weapons and ammunition, discovering that they had 4 rifles, several hundred rounds of ammunition, and various grenades and explosives that could be used defensively. The crashed helicopter also contained additional medical supplies and survival equipment, but she would have to move quickly to retrieve anything useful before enemy forces arrived at their location. The stream provided some natural cover and a source of water, but their position was basically indefensible against a determined attack by multiple insurgent fighters. Sarah realized that their only hope for survival was either immediate rescue by friendly forces or finding a way to evade capture and reach safe territory on foot. Given the serious injuries suffered by her crew members, evacuation seemed like the more realistic option. Using emergency radio equipment that had survived the crash, Sarah attempted to broadcast distress signals on multiple frequencies while scanning for any response from friendly forces in the area. The mountains interfered with radio transmissions, and the enemy jamming equipment was still active, making communication extremely difficult. She managed to send several brief messages, but received no acknowledgement that anyone had heard their calls for help.